a murder case with no evidence. Yet one Alabama man is facing his looming execution on death row. We talked to those fighting to save his life.
We arrived at our conclusion that we were unable to proceed with criminal charges.
The shooting death of Benko Brown has the city of San Francisco divided. Why the DA decided not to press charges.
Listen, if you are a young Black individual and you are considering moving abroad, do it. Just do it.
And more Black folks are moving abroad. But is packing up and leaving as easy as it seems? We'll talk to a woman who helps people do it. Welcome to The Grio. I'm Ebony K. Williams. We start today with a deeply troubling case out of Alabama. That's where officials are looking to execute a Black man who many people say is innocent, including one of the jurors from his own trial. And now his fate rests solely in the hands of the governor. Robin Rocky Myers. He's been on death row for almost 30 years after a jury found him guilty of murdering his neighbor back in 1994. But according to juror May Puckett, nothing ties Myers to the crime. She also claims that some of the other jurors were dead set on finding Myers guilty of murder. And now this is where it gets extremely dicey. The other jurors didn't want the case to be retried out of fear that Myers would be found guilty and executed, so instead, they found him guilty of capital murder. Now, the jurors had planned to vote for life in prison, but Alabama law at that time allowed for the judge to sentence Myers to death. Now, because of an ineffective counsel, Myers is all out of appeals. So now the decision on whether or not he'll be resentenced to serve life in prison or be executed rests solely in the hands of Alabama Governor Kay Ivey. It's a really complicated case, so to help me break this down is Casey Keaton. She's the senior litigator on the case, and joining her is investigator Miriam Bankston. Ladies, thank you both so much for joining. I know that you're fighting to get Rocky clemency in this case, but Casey, I want to start with you. Is Rocky innocent? That's a question that a lot of people are wanting to know. Is he innocent of the murder of Ludie Mae Tucker?
I absolutely believe that Rocky Myers did not commit this crime that he is on death row for.
Yeah, and to that point, it's important to note that many people tend to agree with that take, right? That they're saying that the knife used in the attack was never found. There's no bloody clothing, no hair, none of the forensics that people expect to see in a murder trial of this nature. The second victim who survived could not positively ID him, and his fingerprints were not on the stolen VCR, which was a piece of the evidence there. So, Miriam, I'll go to you. In absence of really no compelling evidence, how was this man convicted?
I'm not sure. I don't understand. I really believe what Ms. Puckett said, that they voted to convict him in order to spare his life. I think that's the only justification that they could make for that.
Mm-hmm. And Casey, I want to go back to you for a second. We know that Rocky Myers does have some intellectual disabilities. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about those and whether or not you feel that they were used against him in this case. And specifically, I'm talking about during the original interrogation.
I think that his intellectual disabilities played a significant role in a number of ways. I think it impacted his ability to interact with his own attorney. I think it impacted absolutely the interrogation with the police officers. Rocky is somebody who tends to be a people pleaser. He tends to want to give a correct answer no matter what. And when pressured, in particular, that is certainly something that he would have been looking for, combined with other issues at the time, because at the time that this occurred, Rocky also struggled significantly with a drug addiction. So that coupled with his cognitive impairments was a significant difficulty for him.
Speaking of the impairment that you speak about, Casey, was this man ever evaluated as to whether or not he was even competent to stand trial? Because we know those competency hearings really turn on the thing that you highlighted, which is the defendant's ability to assist in their own defense and work with their counsel. Was there an evaluation around that for Rocky?
There was his attorney did not have him evaluated or tested in regard to his mental health. They did not gather any records. That was something that we did, our office did, once we took on representation of him, which we were able to gather records dating back to his childhood that demonstrated he was in special education and diagnosed with intellectual disability dating back to the time he was 11 years old. So this is not something manufactured for purposes of an attempt at clemency.
Now, also, this is interesting that Alabama had a law at the time, no longer does, thankfully. But at that time, a judge could supersede a jury's recommendation. And now that law is no longer on the books. And a jury, we know in Rocky's case, voted not for death. The jury said life in prison. Could Governor Ivey put the original recommendation of life in prison back into place?
Absolutely. That is something that she has the power to do as governor with the power of clemency. She could grant that and give him the original sentence that the jury wanted him to have, which is life without the possibility of parole.
Indeed. And, you know, that clemency is not easy to get, I'm sure, as most of us that work in this space of criminal defense work know. But it is indeed possible and often a last resort that many defendants' lives depend on. Ladies, I want you to stay with us. I need to unpack more about this case. Specifically, we're going to talk about the new method of execution that could be used for the very first time in this state. That's next on The Griot.
The Griot, stories powered by us.
Watch our shows live every weeknight on the Griot cable. Check your local listings.
This video is being presented to the governor of Alabama with the hope that you will grant Mr. Myers clemency and uphold the jury's original intent and allow Mr. Myers to live.
A number of petitions and organizations, including the ACLU, Amnesty International, and Change.org, have all joined the fight to save the life of Robin Rocky Myers. He's an Alabama man who's been on death row for over 30 years for a crime that many believe he did not commit. He could soon be executed by the state. That is, of course, unless Governor Kay Ivey grants him clemency or resentences him to his original sentence handed down by the jury, which was life in prison. Still with me is Casey Keaton. She's the senior litigator on the case, and we're joined by investigator Miriam Bankston. I want to start, Miriam, I do want to ask you about your assessment of the investigation. That's very important, but let's take a step back. I don't want to take for granted anything here. Can you help Attorney Keaton define clemency? What's the legal scope of clemency? What does it allow? What does it require?
Clemency is in Alabama is limited solely to the governor, and it is simply mercy at that point. There are no rules in Alabama. It is basically a great big secret. And in Alabama, it has been granted once to a white lady. And that is it in the modern era of the death penalty in Alabama.
Yeah. And clemency is often hinged on the politics of the day, right? How long does this governor have still left in office? I know the couple times I've seen it in my practice, it's always with a governor or a president that is on their way out the door. How much longer in Kay Ivey's tenure?
She is serving her last term at this point. She has, I believe it is 2 years left on her current term.
In addition to no physical evidence tying Mr. Myers to the crime, the victim here, who did know Rocky when he was conscious, so Rocky knew this victim, and this victim was conscious when officers first arrived at the scene, and the victim never mentioned Rocky's name before she died, so there was no identification on her part at that point. So tell me your take on this investigation and where it went wrong.
Well, I think, like you said, not only did she know Mr. Myers, they were neighbors. And when the police came, at no point did she indicate that it was her neighbor, Mr. Myers. She just gave a physical description, instead of saying it's the man that lives over there. And I think part of what wrong is they had a different suspect initially that they had interrogated. And somewhere down the line, witnesses came forward and they gave Mr. Myers' name. And I think that, from my standpoint, their entire investigation revolved around these witness testimonies and identification of Mr. Myers.
And what we know about those are that they're inherently unreliable, especially when it's cross-racial. So were there any elements of that, Miriam, where you see opportunities for misidentifications around any of those issues, be it cross-racial or familial or any of that?
It was more of people gave statements to help out their own cases to avoid, charges for
suspicion coming their way. Yeah, that makes sense. Right. Exactly. All right, Casey, unfortunately for Mr. Myers here, he had an attorney that missed a really important key deadline in his appeal. We know as attorneys, deadlines are everything. People's lives depend on them. There was one back in 2003 that was missed, and now Mr. Myers has no more appeals left. Talk about what the consequences of that are for that attorney that missed that deadline. Is there a reprimand? Does that help Mr. Myers' argument that he had ineffective counsel? What does the consequence look like?
The only thing that happened to the attorney was a public reprimand. So it was like a great big finger wag. And that was it. For Mr. Myers, it meant everything. It meant the loss of his opportunity to complete his appeals in the Alabama state courts, and it meant his incomplete ability to even file and pursue federal appeals. In fact, his entire time in the federal court system was spent asking for the ability to file appeals in the federal system. And ultimately that was denied by the 11th Circuit, and cert was denied by the Supreme Court, simply just asking for the permission to be able to file an out-of-time appeal because of what his attorney had done.
So unfortunately, if it goes that way of execution, the reality is this brand new method of execution has not been tested before. Nitrogen asphyxiation, is it safe? And what are the potential dangers of it being used?
Yeah, I think that is the big question. There is no state that has tried anything like that. We don't even know what, if any, protocol Alabama has yet. I think we have seen with lethal injection that Alabama has made a mess of that. So I think those are the big questions. I don't believe that Alabama could do that right any more than they've done the prior examples correct.
You're doing the God's work, truly indeed. We thank you. Now, after the break, growing outrage in a deadly San Francisco Walgreens shooting. A look at the Banko Brown killing and the DA's decision not to file charges.